Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. My name is Madeline and I create crafting content here on YouTube. In today's video, I'm going to be showing you how to knit this table runner. So I did knit mine out of holiday colors, but of course you can knit yours for any time of the year. So in this video, I'm going to be teaching you a couple of different skills that you'll need to knit this project. And down in the description box below, you're going to find a few things. So the first thing you're going to find is going to be the PDF version of this pattern, which is linked to on my website. That way you can follow along with each one of the steps. Also down there is going to be each one of the video breakpoints or the different timestamps. So that way if you're just looking for a specific part of the video, you can either fast forward or rewind to that specific spot. Also, if you have any questions or comments along the way, feel free to leave them as a comment down below and I'll be happy to get back to you. So how we're actually going to be knitting this table runner, I think incorporates quite a few fun skills to have. So first, we actually start this table runner in the center, and we start with a provisional cast on. Then we're going to knit all the way out one side, work our decreases, cast off. Then we're going to go back to the center position, pick up the other side of the cast on, and then knit in the other direction, decrease, and cast off. Then at the end, I just added on these fun little pom-poms because I think that added a fun little flair to it. So, you can knit this on straight needles or circular knitting needles. I am going to show using circular knitting needles in the video, but this project is one case where you can use straight knitting needles instead if you prefer. Just wanted to mention that. And I think that's about all, but if you do want to share this video with anyone, there's a share button down below. That way you can email it, text it, share it on Facebook, Instagram, all those multiple different options. And then also, if you aren't subscribed to my channel, there's a red subscribe button down below. I'd greatly appreciate it if you subscribed. That way you'll stay up to date on all my future videos. So let's get started. The materials for this project include a size US 10.5 or 6.5 millimeter straight or circular knitting needle, one tapestry needle. You'll need about a yard or two of waste yarn, and it'd be best if it was worsted weight or bulky weight, one stitch marker, and then if you are adding the pom-poms on the end, you'll need a pom-pom maker and some coordinating yarn. The yarn I'm using for this project is a bulky weight yarn from Joann Fabrics. This one is one of their holiday themed yarns, so it's called Big Twist Holiday, and it's a self-striping yarn with white, green, and red stripes. And then I chose the one too that has a gold metallic strand running throughout, just to add a little bit more holiday to it. So again, it's a bulky weight, number 5, and this yarn typically recommends a size US 10 knitting needle. For this project, as I just mentioned, we're going to go a little bit larger than that. So the first thing we have to do in this pattern is calculate how far you need to knit, and that's going to depend on the length of your table. So when I look at my table, it's the style where there's kind of like the curved edges, and then you can change the number of leaves in the middle to either make it longer or shorter. But at the length it is now, it's 82 inches. So now I'm going to follow through the different steps of calculating this value using my 82 inch length. So the first thing I want to do is take that table length of 82 inches and multiply it by 0.85. So that's going to give me a value of 70. Now I'm going to take that table length times 0.85, which is the value we just calculated, and subtract off 12. It's going to give me 58. And now I'm going to take the exact thing we just calculated, that 58, and divide it by 2. So that's going to give me 29 inches. So in the pattern, whenever I see calculated value referred to, in the written pattern, it's like bold and italic so you don't miss it. And then if I ever refer to it in the video, I just put it up in the corner of the screen. So whenever I see that, I'm going to knit to 29 inches. So if instead you use centimeters, so I'm going to repeat this again. So 82 inches in centimeters is 208 centimeters. Again, I'm going to multiply that by 0.85. So that would give me around 177 centimeters. Now instead of 12, it's going to be subtract off 30, because that's 12 inches in centimeters is 30 centimeters. That's going to give me 147. Then 147 divided by 2 is going to give me 74 centimeters. and those two are equivalent. But what actually is this number is if we look at basically the overall shape of the table runner we're knitting, we cast on in the center, so this is our cast on, and then we knit in one direction first. So when we knit in the one direction, the length that we just want to repeat over and over again, that's going to be the 29 inches right here, or whatever your calculated value is. And then I'm going to begin my decreases. So the decreases add on around another 6 inches. Then I'm going to go back to my cast on edge. I'm going to knit another, or repeat the row over and over again for another 29 inches, then work my 6 inches of decreases. So that's why this number is going to be changing pattern to pattern, because the length of our table is going to be different. The next thing we need to keep in mind is that table lengths change, so the length of yarn we need is going to change. So we can either do this in yards or meters, and I'll show it for my table either way. So I typically do use yards. So first I'm going to take my table length in inches. So that's my 82 inches. And I'm going to multiply it by 8.6. And that's going to tell me I need around 705 yards. Now if I do it in the meter required instead, I'm going to take my table length measured in centimeters. So that is 208 centimeters times 3.1. And that's going to give me 644 meters. And of course, this is just a rough estimate. So I always recommend, especially for a project like this, just get one extra ball of yarn. That way you don't have to worry about running out, and you can always return the extra one or exchange it. So let's get started. So for this project, I'm going to be using the Provisional Cast On. And I do use waste yarn when I do that cast on method. So what I have here is just the regular yarn that I'm knitting my project out of. And then I have a piece of waste yarn that's about a yard long. And the weight of this yarn should be just about the same weight as the yarn that we're actually knitting the project with. So when I begin, I want to line up my two ends. And then the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to make a slip knot. So I'm going to lay the two strands over my hand, probably about 8 inches right down there. Grab onto both strands with my bottom 3 fingers. Now I want to take both these strands and go up over my top pointer finger, down below, back up to the top, wrap it around one more time, then bring it down to the bottom. So I basically have like half and then 2 full loops. Now I'm going to take the middle loop, bring it up over the top loop, take the new middle loop, bring it up over the top loop again, and now take that new middle loop, slide it off my finger. So all I've done there is create a little slip knot. So I'm just going to pull on the one side of it to make it a little bit bigger. And that's perfect. So now I need to place my yarn for the actual cast on method and how I want to hold it. So the way I want to hold my yarn is I want my waste yarn, which is this gold yarn, further away from me. And then I want the yarn I'm actually working with closer to me. And I'm just going to unwind a little bit more of this yarn just so it doesn't become tight. Now I'm going to take my knitting needle and I'm going to place it right where this knot is. So it's kind of like I hold the knot with my bottom 3 fingers there and then hold the knitting needle as well. And with my left hand, I'm going to grab onto both strands, not the tails, and I'm going to push away from me on the waste yarn with my pointer finger and towards me on the main color yarn you're using for your project. Now I want to take my knitting needle and I'm going to go in between, then down below the 2 strands, towards myself. Now I'm going to be up above both strands as I go all the way to the back. Now I'm going to go all the way underneath both of the strands. Now I'm going to come up towards myself and then down through the middle. So I now have 2 loops on my knitting needles. And now I'm going to repeat that exact same thing again. So again, I'm pushing away with my pointer finger on the waste yarn towards myself on my working yarn. I'm going to take my knitting needle, go down in between the 2 strands, towards myself, then come up above both strands to the back, down below both strands to the front, come up the front of that strand, and then down the center. Now I have 4 loops on my knitting needle. And I'm going to continue doing this motion over and over again until I have a total of 44 stitches on my needle. So again, just to show it one more time, down the center, towards myself, then up over both strands, down below both strands, up, down through the middle. And I'm just going to continue doing that motion over and over again. Now when you're all finished casting on, all you want to do is you just want to take your waste yarn and just do one little twist around that last strand so that it doesn't come off. So all I've done is wrapped the waste yarn around my actual working yarn. And now you want to go back and double count all your stitches here. So the way I like to count them is I take my waste yarn and I put all the waste yarn down closest to the table so it's not twisted at all. And then I'm just going to count the loops that are on the knitting needle. And the one tricky thing with this cast on is that sometimes they're a little bit hidden. So you can see it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. That looks like 1, 10, 11. You can see how they're all a little twisted differently. But I would do a double count to make sure you do have the right number of stitches. And then when you're ready, we're just going to turn our work and get ready to knit the first row. So again, with that first stitch, you just want to make sure that we don't lose anything. So I'm going to keep my waste yarn wrapped in front of it. And now I'm going to go right into that first stitch as if to knit. And I'm just going to go into each one of these stitches all along the way. And it doesn't look like any of my stitches so far are twisted, but if any of your stitches end up twisted, just knit into the back loop instead. And as I'm working across, I'm just ignoring the waste yarn down at the bottom. So I'm just knitting into each one of these loops as I normally would. Now when I reach that final stitch, you can see that over here on the side, I still just have that knot hanging off to the side. And for right now, I'm just going to leave that there. Now again, I'm going to turn my work and I'm just going to work the regular pattern repeat. So what the regular pattern repeat is going to be, is it's going to be first, we're going to slip the first stitch purlwise with our yarn in front. Then I'm going to take my yarn to the back and knit across the rest of the row. And I'm going to continue working that row over and over again until I've reached just about 1 inch of work. Because once I've reached there, I'm going to go back to my cast on edge and just make sure I didn't lose any stitches along the way. Because I want to make sure that I don't get too far in my work. Like I don't want to knit half of the whole thing, only to realize that my cast on edge didn't quite work out the way I thought it would. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to work an inch and then I'll come back and show you how to check your cast on edge. So I've knit a few rows and now I'm ready to go back and check my cast on edge. So you can already see this cast on edge down here at the bottom. So you see the gold thread just going underneath each one of these red loops. So that's what I want to do when I'm checking it. So I'm just going to take one of my knitting needle points and I'm going to start at the end that doesn't have the knot and I'm going to follow along with this gold thread. So you can see it goes underneath this first red loop, next loop, and I'm just going to go all the way along and follow it and pick up each loop it goes underneath. Okay, so now I've picked up each one of those loops, and now I'm going to go along and count how many there are. So when I count along, I have 44 stitches, and that's exactly what I should have because that's the number of stitches I cast on. So now I feel confident in my provisional cast on. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to back my knitting needle out of there. We're going to leave that strand in, and we'll come back to these stitches later on. So that was all just to check that we had the right number and that nothing was going to start to unravel at any point. So now I'm going to continue repeating over and over again the repeat row of slip the first stitch purlwise with the yarn in front, bring the yarn to the back, knit all the way across, turn my work, and repeat the exact same thing over and over again until I reach that calculated value from the beginning of the video, which for me was 29 inches. So now I've finished knitting to the length I calculated earlier in the video, and my next step is going to be to work the decrease rows to create that taper inwards. So to do this, the first thing I recommend is that you take a removable stitch marker. If you don't have one of these, you can also just take a piece of yarn and just tie it onto one side of your work. And I'm going to put it onto the side of my work that's facing me, and I'm about to knit across this row, so this side's up. That's the side I'm going to put it on. So how these decrease rows are going to work is we're going to work one decrease row, and that's going to be worked on the side with the stitch marker. Then we're going to turn our work, and we're just going to work the same row as previously where we slip the first stitch purlwise, knit across the rest of the row. And we're going to continue repeating those over and over again until there's a total of 4 stitches remaining. So for the decrease row, we're going to slip the first stitch purlwise, bring the yarn to the back, work a decrease called a slip slip knit, knit until 3 stitches remain, work a knit 2 together, then knit the final stitch. So now I'm going to zoom in and show you those steps. So first I'm going to slip the first stitch purlwise, bring my yarn to the back. Now I'm working the decrease called a slip slip knit. So I'm going to slip the first stitch as if to knit, slip the second stitch as if to knit. Now I want to pass each one of those back over to my left knitting needle. So all I did was twist each one of those 2 stitches. Now I'm going to take my right knitting needle point, go into the back of both those stitches, and knit them together. And that is a slip slip knit. So you can see, it's a little tricky to see right after you do it, but it's a left leaning decrease. Now I'm going to continue knitting until 3 stitches remain. I'm at those final 3 stitches, so next I'm going to work a knit 2 together. So the knit 2 together, I'm going to take my right knitting needle point into the second stitch and the first stitch, going from the left over towards the right. I went through both those stitches, wrap my yarn around, pull through. So that one was a right leaning decrease. Now I'm going to knit the final stitch. Now when I turn my work on the side without the stitch marker, I'm just going to work the regular row that I worked for the rest of this. So I'm going to slip the first stitch purlwise, bring my yarn to the back, knit across the rest of this row. So now again, when I turn my work, I'll be back on the side with the stitch marker, so I'm going to work another decrease row. And again, I'm going to continue alternating between the decrease row and the knit row over and over again until I have 4 stitches remaining. I just finished my last decrease row, and now I have 4 stitches on my needle, so I'm going to turn my work, and I'm going to cast off those 4 stitches. So to do that, I'm going to slip the first stitch purlwise, bring my yarn to the back, knit the next stitch. Now I'm going to pass that first stitch, or the one furthest to the right on the right knitting needle, up, over, and off that second stitch. Now I'm going to knit the next stitch from my left knitting needle, pass the previous stitch, or the first one furthest to the right, up, over, and off that second stitch. And again, with the final stitch, I'm going to knit it, pass the previous stitch, up, over, and off. Now what I like to do is I just tug on it a little bit, and then pull my working yarn through that. just to tie a little knot. So now I'm going to break my yarn there, leaving a little bit of a tail, about 8 inches. So now that I've cast off this side, I am going to leave the stitch marker on so that I make sure I do the other set of decreases on the same side. And I mean, they do look pretty similar, so you wouldn't notice all that much. I just prefer it that way. Now I'm back at my cast on edge for this next step, and what I want to do is I want to follow along this gold piece of thread and pick up each one of the loops. Similarly to at the beginning when we were checking the number of stitches we cast on, doing the exact same thing. So I'm going to start over here at the side that doesn't have my yarn tail on it. So I'm going to start over here, pick them all the way up, and then I'm going to approach where this slip knot is over here at the other side. Okay, so once I've picked up all those loops, before I pull out this gold waste yarn, I'm going to go along and double count how many stitches I have on my knitting needle, and it should be the exact same number I cast on. So I should have the 44 stitches going across here. Okay, so I do 44 stitches. So now what I do is I go along and I'm just going to start pulling out this gold thread. I do it piece by piece because sometimes it can snag on some of the yarn. And now I'm also going to undo this knot over here at the other side. So now we've taken our waste yarn completely out and we're ready to start knitting again. So now that I've finished picking up the stitches and taking out the waste yarn, the next step is making sure I'm about to start knitting on the right side of the work. So if I look at the side of the work that my knitting needle is currently pointing out of, and I pull it down, I can see that right below the stitch on my knitting needle is kind of like a flat stitch. So it makes almost like the little heart shape there. Now if I turn my work over and point my knitting needle towards the right, or sorry, towards the left, and I pull my work down, you can see that right below the knitting needle is a bump. So this is the side I want to knit from. So to do that, if you're on circular knitting needles, so this is the way we just picked up the stitches. We went from the side without the slip knot over to the side with the slip knot. So all I have to do is take this knitting needle and slide it over towards the right so that my work ends up on the other point. Then I can turn my work and start knitting over here on the right hand side where you can see the little bumps. Now, if you're knitting on straight knitting needles here, all you have to do is you're just gonna take your work and you're just gonna slip each stitch over onto your other knitting needle and just go all the way across this row. So now that I'm sure which side of the work I wanna begin knitting on, I have my knitting needle point over towards the right, and you can see the purl bumps just below the knitting needle. So this is the correct side to start working on. I'm gonna rejoin my new ball of yarn, and I am trying to match up the stripes as much as I can. So basically I just take the next color, I find it in my ball of yarn, I cut off all the extra, and then I just rejoin the yarn so that all the stripes match up. And you can see an example of it right down here. So basically I made it join up in the middle of this green stripe by connecting the joins. And then with the extra yarn, I just save it that I cut off, and I can make pom-poms with this one later on so it's not wasted. As we work across this initial row, we just want to knit into each one of the stitches. The only tricky thing that can occur in this row is that some of the stitches will be twisted, and in those cases we want to untwist them. I felt like it was a little tricky to see on that other yarn, me going across that first row and untwisting stitches. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you on this little tiny sample the difference between untwisted and twisted stitches and how to fix any of the ones that are twisted. So if I look at this first stitch here, and what you can do is you can pull it down a little bit. There's the front part of the stitch, and then there's the back part of the stitch. So I call the front part the part that's closest to me coming down, and then the back part is the one furthest away from me. And on this first stitch, you can see that if I pull this down, the front part of the stitch is towards the right, and then the back part of the stitch is towards the left. So it's kind of like if you're looking at it from the top, it's angled in this direction. So that means that's a regular knit stitch. And if you go into that, you aren't going to feel any friction or anything. It's just going to feel right like a regular knit stitch. Now in this next stitch, again, if I pull it down, I can see that the front part of the stitch is further towards the right than the back part of the stitch. It's a very slight angling, but again, you can see it's angled this way. So that's just a regular knit stitch. Now right here on this one, I can already tell. So when I pull this down, the front part of the stitch is towards the left and the back part of the stitch is over towards the right. So this one's actually angled this way. So the way we want to fix this twisted stitch is either we can A, untwist it, or B, we can knit it through the back loop. Either one of those will result in the same exact thing. So to untwist it, what you'd want to do is you want to take your right knitting needle point, go in between that first and second stitch, pick up that first stitch kind of like from the inside going over towards the right. Now it's on your right knitting needle. Now you just want to slide that one back over, basically like purlwise, so don't twist it anymore. And now when I look at that stitch, it's now untwisted, or the front part of the stitch is towards the right, back part is towards the left. And now I could just knit this one regularly. Now again, this next stitch is going to be twisted. So the other alternative is I can knit it through the back loop. So if you did just go to knit this one regularly, you'd notice that it's a little tighter than your knit stitches usually are. And that's because if you did knit this one regularly, it would be a twisted stitch. So that's another way to tell as well. But if I wanted to just fix this without untwisting it, I'm just going to take my right knitting needle point and go from the right to the left, right into the middle of that stitch. Wrap my yarn around and pull through. And now you can see that none of these stitches are twisted at all. So those are the two alternatives. You can either A, untwist the stitch, or B, knit it through the back loop. And again, you want your knit stitches to be angled this way, where the front part of the loop is over towards the right, back part of the loop is towards the left, just like this next stitch on the knitting needle. And if your stitches are angled the opposite way, you need to either untwist them or knit them through the back loop for this project. So now that I've shown you that technique, we just want to continue working across that initial row, again, untwisting any of the twisted stitches, and knit across each one of the stitches. So now that I've finished going across that first row, untwisting all the stitches and knitting across, I'm just going to go back to knitting row after row of slip the first stitch purlwise, knit across, turn my work, and then repeat the same thing over and over again until I reach that same length that I knit for the other side. Now you do want to make sure you know where you started knitting this side. So a good way to tell is basically with that cast on edge over here, I still have that so I can measure from there and go up to the bottom of the knitting needle. So now I've continued knitting all the way up to second half, and then I did my decreases as well. So I've moved my stitch marker from the other side of my work over to this side, and then I did my decreases and cast off. I've also weaved in all my ends along the way. The only ends I've left are going to be these end ones right here, so the one where I cast off on either side. I also left this one here just for now, just so you could see where my middle point is. So this was the center of my work where I began working out in each direction. So the next thing I want to do is I want to block this piece. So you can see right now it's a little short on either side of the table, and that's done on purpose, because what we want to do is we're going to soak this and then block it, and when we block it, we're going to want this to stretch out to either side of the table. So what you want to do before we begin this blocking process is, again, you want to weave in all your ends except these end two. We're going to use these end ones to tie on the pom-poms. So once you've done that, then I'm going to show you the blocking process next. First, starting out with the materials, you need to actually soak the table runner. First, you just need some dish soap. So you can use this bottle's method, you can use Dawn. Those are the two that I typically use. And you just need like a little tiny bit of it. Like I just use one pump of this. Then you're gonna want some towels to dry it with. And basically we're gonna like roll it up in the towel to try and get a lot of that extra moisture out after we soak it. So I just like to use beach towels. And then lastly, here I have a bucket. And this bucket is currently about 2/3 of the way full, I'd say, with just like lukewarm water. So basically just a little bit warmer than room temperature. And in this, I put one pump of the dish soap. So that's why we have bubbles in here. Then once we soak it, you're either gonna wanna use something like a drying rack right here. And if you use the drying rack, all you're gonna wanna do is you're just gonna wanna lay it over. So you could go like across these two bottom portions, you could go up over the top and down. And basically that'll just allow the weight of the actual moisture, like pulling on the table runner, to drag it out and be larger than it is right now. Now, if you do have blocking mats, that's another alternative. So these right here are my blocking mats. And these are actually just like those foam tiles that I think these are actually from Tractor Supplies where I got these. But I have a set of 4 of them and they all connect to each other so that way I can make one long strip. So you could use some of these foam tiles. And then I also just have a little set of pins. T-pins work best, that way you can see them and take them out easily. But basically what we do is we just stretch it out along the 4 tiles and pin it in place. And that way as it dries, we can stretch it out and it'll dry in that stretched out form. So those are our 2 alternatives. But first I'm gonna show you the soaking process. So now I've taken off my stitch marker and I'm just gonna begin rolling up this table runner. That way I can easily fit it into the bucket. Okay, and all I'm gonna do is just place it right in here. And you wanna try and get as much of it wet as you can. It doesn't really matter if you like bend it or fold it at all. And now I'm just gonna let this soak in the bucket for about 20 minutes. So now I'm over at my sink, and the next thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna pour out all this soapy water and just rinse it out with some basically room temperature water, just to get rid of all the bubbles on top. And you definitely don't have to wear gloves. I just don't want to mess up my nails, so I always wear gloves. Okay, so now I've gotten all the bubbles out of there. So the next thing I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna pick it up. And I'm just gonna start up here at the top and I'm just gonna gently squeeze it. Move down a little bit, gently squeeze again. I'm going to do that exact same thing one more time. So now we're all done with the bucket, so now I'm going to move over to the other side and use the towel. So now here, I want to unroll this, and I'm kind of going to zigzag it onto the towel. Now, starting at the bottom, I'm just going to roll the towel up. And now I just press down and squeeze all the way along. And you can already see the water coming through. And now what I like to do is I'm going to take this piece off, flip my towel around to the other side. That's a little bit drier. And now I'm going to lay it down in a similar way. Roll it up again. So now I'm all ready for either the drying rack or the blocking boards. And I just wanted to show you real quick too. So it's still wet right now, but I just laid it out on the table and you can see it's already grown by almost 10 inches in length. If you're going for the drying rack method, I would recommend just stretching it out over the sides like this. And gravity will help you a little bit and pull each side downwards. You could also use this center one if you have a drying rack that's this style. And again, gravity will help you pull it. You might just end up with a slightly narrower size right in the middle. Next up, I'll show you the blocking boards. And now here, I'm just gonna lay it down. And I'm probably gonna try and put my center green stripe, which is this one right here, in the middle of my mats. That way I can pay attention to how far I'm stretching it on either side, just to keep it even. So I'm gonna start in the middle pinning, and then I'm just gonna stretch it a little bit, pin some more, stretch the next section a little bit, pin more, and go all the way down to the end. So I think that looks pretty good right there. So now I'm just gonna let it dry in place. Then once it's dry, I'm just gonna take out all the pins And next up, I'll show you how to add the pom-poms to each end. So I've now taken my table runner off of the blocking mats and I've laid it out on the table, and it ended up being the perfect size for me, so that's great. It goes just to the very end on either side. So now the last thing I'm going to do is completely optional again, but I think it just adds a little bit more fun flair to the project. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add one pom-pom to either end. So what I have here is one of the sets of pom-pom makers. I just got mine off Amazon, and I'm going to use the second to largest one. So this one is a 6.8 centimeter pom-pom maker. I'll link one of these pom-pom makers down below in case you are curious. I end up using these all the time. And then here I just have some white yarn. So this is just the Vanna's Choice medium weight or number 4 yarn. And then I have some cotton yarn to tie them up with because I couldn't find any embroidery floss in white, so I'm just going to use cotton yarn. So I'm going to go ahead and make a pom-pom for either side. Now that I have both my pom-poms made, I'm going to add these to each end of my table runner. And to do that, I'm going to use the edges that I left, or the strings, from each one of my cast-offs. So those are all the steps to knit this table runner. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to leave those down below. If you're new to my channel, don't forget to hit that red subscribe button. That way you'll stay up to date on all my videos. Also, if you want to share this video with anyone, there's a little share button down below. That way you can text it, email it, do all those different things. And I'll see you in my next video. Bye.